Well, good evening, everyone. That's great. I'm starting to feel like I'm in the company of old friends now, so that's just really fabulous. Thank you for coming. I'm Lisa German. I'm the University Librarian and Dean of Libraries. And it seems like we are in the middle of the center of the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle metaverse tonight. And what an interesting place that's going to turn out to be. Tonight's event features a conversation between two collectors and two experts of Sherlock Holmes. Our very own Dick Sveum, who is on the board of the Friends of the Libraries and who soon will be on the board of the Friends of the Anderson Horticulture Library. So if I'm going to just put in a plug for that library, since that's in our world too. If you haven't been out to the Arboretum, I invite you all to go and see that wonderful library that's out there. And I'd really like to say thank you to both Dick and to Glen. And before we begin this evening's program, however, let's acknowledge the peoples on whose ancestral lands we gather. The University of Minnesota is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to strengthen and improve our relations with tribal nations. We also acknowledge words are not enough, that we must ensure that this institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So now I am pleased as punch to introduce someone you all know, our curator of our Sherlock Holmes collection, Tim Johnson.
Thank you, Lisa. Good evening, and thank you for coming out on a very Moriarty-esque Minnesota winter night. I'm delighted to introduce our conversants for the evening, and I'm going to do so quickly so that we can enjoy the fruits of their conversation. Glen Miranker is well known in the computer industry. Moriarty at it again. In the computer industry, especially for his work with Steve Jobs at Next and later at Apple. His networks also extend to the University of Virginia's Rare Book School, the San Francisco Silent Film Festival, the Baker Street Irregulars Trust, the American Foundation for the Toronto Public Library, the Russell Engelman Rheumatology Research Center at the University of California, San Francisco, and the National Cryptologic Museum in Annapolis Junction, Maryland. Richard Sveum, aka Dick, like Glen, is well known in the healthcare community, especially for his work with young allergy patients through Park Nicollet Clinics, the American Lung Association and its leadership board and Camp Super Kids program, the University of Minnesota Medical School as a clinical professor in pediatrics and medicine, the National Consortium on Children's Asthma Camps, and the longtime president of the Friends of the Sherlock Holmes collections here at the university, also the board of the Ampersand Club, and most recently, as you just heard, now president of the Friends of the Anderson Horticultural Library. Both Glen and Dick are longtime collectors and lovers of the written and printed word. Members of the Grolier Club, invested members of the Baker Street Irregulars, well-versed in the bibliography of Sherlock Holmes and in the joys of interacting with Sherlockians around the world. Their paths have crossed many times in many venues, and we're delighted to have them both here this evening. Following their conversation, I invite you to join them in a time of refreshment and an opportunity to view the truly stellar Sherlock Holmes in 221 objects. an exhibition from the collection of Glen S. Miranker. Now please, on a cold winter night, join me in welcoming Glen and Dick in what promises to be an interesting conversation with collectors.
Well, thanks, Lisa and Tim, for the kind introduction. I want to especially here thank Glen for the exhibiting and sharing his collection with Minnesota. I know you missed the opening of the exhibit the other night, and Kathy was very eloquent. But is there anything that you wanted to tell us before we get started?
Well, my suspicion is that Kathy very nicely and adequately covered it, but I would like to share a small story with you about my collecting and collections. I had just begun. I was a grad student. I had just begun collecting. I had pretty much decided that I was only even contemplated collecting Sherlock. So, and I'd pretty much made up my mind that I would collect writings about the writings, that these rarefied things called first editions and so forth would always be out of reach, both in reality and both financially. So I started collecting writings about the writings, and my collection was very small at this point. One shelf, 1.5 feet. But 2 of the books that I had were Cultivating Sherlock Holmes and Sherlock Holmes Master Detective, distinguished Norwegian explorers. And I don't remember how, but I found out that McDiarmid was still with us, and I packed up those 2 books and I mailed them to him, and he inscribed them and returned them. So 2 of the very first books in my collection are inscribed to me, McDiarmid books.
That's pretty cool. Every item on display, all 221 objects, has a story, a backstory, and we're going to save some of that for the gallery tour, which we're going to have on April 20th. Mark your calendars. And we're going to try to focus our conversation on your collecting Sherlockiana. I once gave a talk to the Copper Beeches, and my talk was, there's 4 questions that every collector must answer. Why do you collect? Why do you collect Sherlock Holmes? Have you read all the books? And what are you going to do with your collection when you're gone? Those are the 4 questions. So the first question about why do you collect? Were you a born collector as a boy? Did you have stamps, coins, baseball cards, comic books?
Yes, I was a collector as a boy. I had, I had a mineral collection. Did not have a stamp collection. Baseball cards. I think that's pretty much it. My mineral collection and my baseball cards. But certainly at that age, at least I was not even for a 10, 15-year-old, was not a serious collector. That is, it was a little side activity. I didn't become interested in collecting until in anything approaching a serious way till I was in grad school. And it all started one Saturday. I was at home working away on my thesis, and no doubt in a really foul mood. And Kathy, my wife, went out for a walk, and she comes back and she says, "I got you a present to cheer you up." And she hands me this book. It was an American first edition of the Case Book of Sherlock Holmes, the last of the collected Sherlock Holmes short stories. And I looked at the book, and a light bulb went off. I really did say, "You mean you don't have to be J.P. Morgan to collect books?" Just hadn't occurred to me. And I queried her, and she had stumbled upon a small antiquarian book show a few blocks away in the basement of the Harvard Gutman Library, the education library. And I said, well, is it open tomorrow? I want to go. And as many of you know, book fairs are typically open Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And so we went, and I was hooked, captivated, done for at that moment.
Let's back up before we get to that book fair. When do you think you became a Sherlockian? Are you a Sherlockian?
Oh, most assuredly.
And you read the stories when you were 12?
Well, I had read the stories when I was a child, but
did you think of yourself as Sherlock Holmes? I
Oh,
mean, are you the smartest guy in the room?
that mental disorder didn't set in until around grad school days, and I'm cured, but or I think I'm cured. No, I had read the stories as a boy, and I enjoyed them very much, but they hadn't assumed any particular stature in my attention, my esteem. But when I was an undergrad, my roommate comes back one evening. I'm in a funk. Probably I'd been turned down for a date or thought I blew a test, some cosmic undergraduate event like that. And he grabs this big fat book and he throws it at me and he says, read these, it'll cheer you up. And the book was the complete stories of Sherlock Holmes. And I started reading them again and was absolutely captivated by the characters, the Victorian London. And in fact, I started reading them avidly, and I got finally through the bulk of the book, and I said to myself all of a sudden, wait a second, I haven't read this particular story. Evidently, I had put it down when I was a little boy with 3 or 4 stories remaining, and I put the book away because I didn't want there to be no more Sherlock Holmes stories. And in fact, didn't read to the very end of the book, for another year or two. So I could save those stories. But what I did find out by chance encounters that there were like-minded folks in the world, that they were great fun, very interesting, got together periodically, ate very well, drank to excess as a general rule. Many of them. And so I fell in with this bad lot. That's when I became a Sherlockian.
And that was when you were still an undergraduate?
I'm still an undergraduate, yeah.
And so when you started collecting Sherlockiana, you had that writings on the writings before Kathy came home with the casebook?
No, I had nothing.
You had nothing?
No, I had the 2-volume Doubleday.
So
literally, that is it.
Did you follow a list? Did you take advice from others? Is that story go on that you met other?
Oh, I was fortunate in that book fair. We went up to the card table of the dealer where Kathy got that book, and it was this fellow named Peter Stern, who I think, yes, I see an awful lot of. And there was also a fellow having a chat with Peter at that, and a fellow named Dan Poznansky. So from the absolute very beginning, I met Dan and Peter. And to say that a substantial part of my education came from these two gentlemen, particularly Dan, it would be a horrible understatement. In fact, may I tell you another story? A couple of weeks later, I had been, Dan, even in the quick conversation we had at that book fair, had described the places I needed to visit to find Sherlockian treasures. And so I had established this orbit, which I went on many Saturdays around 3 or 4 or 5 of the antiquarian bookstores in Boston and Cambridge. And I was very proud of the books I had assembled. As I said, they were. And I happened to bump into Dan at Harvard Square, and I said, Dan, you've got to come over and see my collection. I think I'm doing really well. So we went back to Kathy and my place, and I showed him the books, and he said, Glenny, I have an appointment, I've got to go, but let's meet next weekend. And I said, fine, Saturday is good. He says, okay. And Poznansky came over to my place the following Saturday with 4 boxes of books. And we haul them up to my place, and he says, these are the basic books that any Sherlockian collector needs. And he went through them in great detail, explaining why they were important, in the context of a collection they represented. And of course, that's an extraordinary experience, but I have found that at least the collectors in my area are very generous with their time and knowledge. I mean, Dan's generosity is spectacular, but I found many of these. So I learned from other collectors.
Do you have any other people that you consider mentors in your Sherlockian collecting?
Oh, for sure. There was a fellow named Marv Epstein. He passed away quite some time ago. He was an extraordinary collector. He had an absolutely voracious curiosity, encyclopedic memory.
Was he a computer guy?
He was a mathematician. He was a mathematician at Bell Labs. And actually, through that connection, he also, besides unbounded energy and unbounded curiosity, he had a secret weapon. I think not you two, but most of you are old enough to remember when telephone calls cost money. Particularly,
did he have a Watts line from Bell Labs?
He had a Watts line. And he burned up that telephone calling, dealers and collectors. And he had managed to assemble a fairly impressive detective fiction collection, but a spectacular Sherlock Holmes collection. And in particular, he discovered any number of, things of unknown bibliographic importance.
Is there anyone you consider your rival in collecting Sherlockiana?
Well, certainly a reasonable question. I don't consider collecting a competitive sport. It's certainly the case. There are any number of times, places, occasions where there'll be collectors I know well, and we're both clearly interested in the same object. But I don't feel competitive.
So you've said before, though, that part of collecting is the passion and the curiosity that drives you. But tell me more about the rewards of sharing. You're saying that there's a cooperative element?
Oh, I think so. I think I know in principle there are collectors who sit in their offices or their libraries and look at their stuff and chortle about it, and that's all they do. I don't understand that kind of collecting. I think that the rewards of sharing what you've learned, the interesting things about the books that comprise your collection, are far deeper, far richer, far more meaningful if you share them. And there are many ways to share. I, from time to time, give lecture on collecting or collections, and as an example. And I don't understand collectors that don't actively do that.
You've also said that you're a custodian of these objects.
Well, these books are not ours forever. Sometime they're not going to be mine anymore. What I'm going to do with them is another matter, whether I find a new home for the library largely intact, or I put them up for sale and they enrich other, new generation of collectors, but they're not mine forever. And so as a custodian, I have obligations. And certainly the most basic is to take good care of them. But I think another custodial, and I don't like using this phrase because it's a joy, but another custodial obligation is to make them available. So, people are more than welcome to visit me. I've had any number of folks that have come and spent a good deal of time. One of my favorite examples of that is Andrew Lysette. He published the most comprehensive, I think the best researched biography of Conan Doyle. Kathy, 5-6 years ago now, 7 years, something like that.
Oh, it's more than 10.
10, okay, I lose track of time. 10 years ago. And Andrew got in touch with me, and we had him as a house guest for about a week. And man, oh man, he got up every morning at a decent hour, went into my libraries, and I would stick my head in and say, well, can I help you find something? Want to go out for a second? No. And then at 5, 6 in the evening, he'd knock off, and we would have a very pleasant evening sipping whiskey. And measure of generosity, and yet another measure of generosity, is a few years after that, my older daughter did a year abroad in London. And she's a wonderful lady. And she got in touch with Lysette. And Lysette and his partner had her over for dinner a handful of times. And
I can verify that you're generous with your collection. You allowed me to see an unpublished poem that Doyle had written that we used for ACD at 35. But let's go back to your book collecting career. I'm interested in this. You talked about how early in your career you were a book hunter and you made the rounds. You went into actual bookstores in search of treasure. Do you still go into bookstores? Are you now the hunted by the booksellers? Do you buy books at fairs, online, auctions? Where do you get your material?
I certainly still go to bookstores. If I'm in a new city or a city which I'm in infrequently, I do my best to make extra time to prowl their shops. But I have and continue to use every mechanism I can think of to turn up materials. One that may be unusual to many of you folks is used furniture stores. Some of them buy these bookcases or wardrobes or something, and the previous owner kept books in them and didn't bother emptying out the furniture. I have, it has not been paying off like it did 30 years ago, but I've gotten more than a few books from used bookstores. Now, I just use that as an example of it's not possible to cast your net too wide.
Terry Ballinger told the Baker Street Irregulars that if you buy a book online, that's not book collecting, that's shopping.
Yes.
Do you believe that?
Well, actually, I was at a talk by Terry Ballinger a gazillion years ago, and he used that phrase, and it quite resonated. My background is high tech, and for the first good chunk of time, I don't remember how long, 3, 4, 5, 8 years, I did not use the internet consciously. Books and book hunting were a different world. It was a place for me to be someplace else than working on computers and with computers. I finally decided I was cutting off my nose to spite my face and have given in, and I use it avidly, voraciously. My experience, though, is Terry, who's modified his position a little bit, it's a very poor experience compared to, for example, going to bookstores or going to auctions. It's rare you will learn anything. You can learn things on the web if you do some research, But the mere act of walking into a shop, chatting with the customers or the owner of the shop, you learn things. And I certainly miss the sociability. It's not gone, but I do it a heck of a lot less. You know, when I was starting out, when I was in grad school, that was a fairly regular Saturday morning exercise to go around to these bookstores. And so I don't think it's fair to call it shopping.
So you said you tried to keep the book collecting and the computers separate, but I'm interested. I've heard that you have a process that when you buy a book, it goes through some entry and that you have an online database. Is that true?
Well, yes, I do. But, you know, it is a tool, and my online database is database I wrote myself, is it is indistinguishable, except that it lives on the hard drive and stuff like that than index cards. Same kind of information, same organization.
But do you study the objects you bring into your collection? I mean, you...
Oh, for sure.
You just don't put them on the shelf.
Oh, no, for sure. One of the delights in books in general, whether you collect or not, is the information, the story that the books have other than what's on the text block. Michael Suarez of the Rare Book School refers to this as reading the whole book. And for me, the things that really look, if you pick up a copy, doesn't matter what it is, if it's an early pirate or a first edition or first edition second state or whatever, give or take typographical errors, the story is the same as you can download now free for nothing onto your reader or print out on paper if you prefer it, or read on your screen. It's not the story that makes the book fascinating. It's why it was printed. It's how it was printed. It's how it was written. Is what audience was it intended for? Where has the book been particularly successful? Does the story itself have, if you pardon the expression, legs above and beyond it? Are there movies? Are there radio programs that use it as a source of material? These are the things that I find most interesting.
If the Sherlock Holmes in 221 objects is less than 3% of your collection, what are we missing?
Well, let me maybe I'll answer that in a sort of backwards fashion. My collection has 6,000 or 7,000 items in it, and the reason I'm not entirely sure is actually twofold. As I said, it's not a database. It's sort of like index cards. So, for example, there's one entry for the Baker Street Journal, 1946 to current, which was a quarterly. So that one entry is 200 or plus items. The other is an area I'm extremely fond of collecting are pirated editions, and I have not. With the exception of the handful of pirates that have some bibliographic importance, I have not cataloged any of them. And there are probably 12 or 1,300 of those. So that's why I don't know the exact number. When I've cataloged all my pirates, then I will know precisely how many items are. Well, no, then I won't know because they're the occasional entry, which represents 200 items, but I'll know more precisely. So the areas that are not here is when I assembled the collection, the exhibition. Kathy and I discussed it, and two things we wanted, two characteristics we wanted in the exhibit. One was that there'd be a lot of people who were going to come and view the exhibit who weren't Sherlockians. So there were certain things which were just as exciting or whatever to a Sherlockian were just not appropriate. So, for example, there are no writings about the writings in the exhibition. So there's a whole broad area, a whole class. Similarly, I made queries as to the amount of space there was, and it became apparent that something like 200 items would be all that could be accommodated. And then, of course, I said, well, Holmes and Watson lived at 221 B. Baker Street, so there'll be 220. I even contemplated cutting a book in half so that it could be 220, but I didn't. So it's just 221 items. And then the last last consideration is there were stories that we wanted to tell. That is a story for example, of Conan Doyle's transformation from a failing physician to a budding, sought-after author. And the big transition is around 1890, and you see some of the things. You see, for example, some letters that talk about how J.M. Stoddard, who was the editor at that point of Lippincott's, an American magazine, they decided that they wanted to publish their magazine in London as well for that English-speaking audience. He made a trip to Stoddard, that is, made a trip to London to do some business negotiations, and also to make contact with authors who would be sources for the material that would fill the magazine. And one evening, he took two young authors out to dinner at the Langham Hotel. One of them was Arthur Conan Doyle, and the other was a fellow named Oscar Wilde. And they both Stoddard commissioned a piece from both of them. Conan Doyle wrote a Sign of Four in 8-10 weeks after dinner. And 15, 16 months later, Oscar Wilde delivered this, what the heck was it called? Pictures of Dorian Gray. Doyle refers to this as a golden evening and was central in his thinking of giving up on being a practicing physician.
There is said to be the Cathy Challenge, which is, how will the desired object enhance your collection? When did you start following the Cathy Challenge? And has it helped you improve your collection or avoid any pitfalls?
Well, I'd like to slightly rephrase that, if I may. Cathy has been consistently and enthusiastically supportive of my collection. And very enthusiastic. And some small number of years ago, things did change. But the way they changed is when I'm particularly excited about something, she just asks, how will this improve your collection? So, which, by the way, was unusual. There's a slightly inappropriate joke in the book-selling world that the wife is the natural enemy of the book dealer. But it's not the case in this particular household. And I have to say, and I think she figured this out kind of instantly, I quickly cottoned on she was going to ask me that question. So I usually prepare an answer before I share with her that I'm going to go after a new particular item.
This exhibit is single author, Arthur Conan Doyle, single subject, only his Sherlock Holmes writings. You follow the character Sherlock Holmes onto the stage, and I know you're interested in some of the popular culture because I've heard a Grow Your lecture where you talked about portrayals of Sherlock Holmes in advertising. But do you read pastiches?
Not very much. And I have to say, with a few exceptions, and I'll tell you which ones right now, in a minute, I find the early pastiches, a good number of them are clever and entertaining. But if I actually didn't check prior to come in, but if you were to go on Amazon and look at the number of Sherlockian pastiches available right now in print. There's hundreds of them.
Hundreds. I have 5,000 in my
No,
collection.
I mean right now. No, I mean right now
That haven't gone off.
that are waiting for that are in print, ready to buy right now. And this has been going on for 150 years, 140 years. So but there are some, for example, I think Nick Meyer's stuff is excellent. Going back a little earlier, I think the August Derleth Solar Ponds are quite good. But by and large, and then there are individual stories here and there. But by and large, I don't read pastiches.
Do you collect them? Do you have Bonnie McBird's run? Do you have Laurie King's run? Do you have?
As I said, there are a few exceptions. I do collect pastiches, and I can't. I can only give you one or two of the rules that I use. First and foremost, I have to like the author or have liked one of their stories. This seems to, by and large, shut off the pastiches I collect in 1930, 1940. But there are a couple of contemporary writers like Laurie King, like Bonnie McBird, and I do have their books. Yes, and they are in my collection and they are in my library, but I think of them less so as collectibles than books I like to read.
You're interested in the minutiae of bibliography and have discovered several important details about publications. What makes the bibliography interesting to you? Tell us more about your fascination with pirates. Are you still hunting with the 1,300 you have at home? Are you still looking for more?
Oh, absolutely. I am absolutely confident that there are plenty more out there. And I don't, in spite of the impressive number, there are no duplicates. I mean, I may have made a mistake or two. And the minutiae will come forward in a second. When I say not duplicate, if the color of the binding is different, it's not a duplicate. Something that's pretty common in pirated editions is they have some sort of end matter. In some cases, there'll be a story, a whole story, unheralded on the title of the book, unheralded in the table of contents, but there's besides the headline title, for example, Sign of Four, there'll be a story or two. Often that varies from copy to copy. If they're different books. Many pirates have advertisements, and the advertisements may be different. So in some regard, they're all different, and I'm quite confident there are more that I have yet to find. Now, why is this important? Well, I mean, in the cosmic sense, no, but it can tell you a great deal about a book. It can tell you, for example, it may tell you when it was printed. The advertisements are often very helpful because one of the things I have done with several of the books is I've looked up to see the advertisements with the same graphics that appeared in local newspapers. Now, this is hardly proof, but I assume these guys were cheap, that if they paid for the art, they used it again. And so I assume that I deduce that the print date was approximately that of the advertisement in the local newspaper. That's just a for instance. It's not quite advertising, but one of the books here is a Sign of Four, which was a pirated Sign of Four, which was inscribed by Arthur Conan Doyle very cordially. And as you would guess, if you don't know, he had a very poor opinion of pirate publishers. I mean, the pirate publishers published his stories, didn't pay him a cent. The books themselves are, by and large, pretty shabby. So so there was nothing to like. But he inscribed this book. Well, I wanted. And also in this book, on the end paper, is the ownership signature of the person it was inscribed to, a guy named Harlow N. Higginbotham. Well, who the hell is Harlow N. Higginbotham? It turns out Harlow N. Higginbotham was a big shot in Chicago in the latter part of the 19th century. And 19th century. And by big shot, I mean he was one of the founders of the Marshall Field department store. He was one of the founders of the Field Museum. I think at the relevant time, I think he was president of the Field Museum. He was a well-known and beloved philanthropist, food, clothing, and so forth. He was also the president of the 1893 Columbian Exposition. World's Fair celebrate the 100th birthday of the discovery of the United States, of America. And I found out that one of his privileges as president was the admissions tickets had his signature on it. So I get on eBay and I buy myself an admission ticket to the 1893 Columbian Expo, which are plentiful, by the way, and compare the signatures. So that's how I verified the signature. I think so. The chasing down, and so why is the minutia important? Well, I wanted to be absolutely sure that this book had been in Chicago, and that the among the things I used to satisfy myself that the signatures were real, not forgeries, was that I looked up and Higginbotham, in fact, hosted Conan Doyle's speech in Chicago on October 12th, 1895.
The most incredible part of your collection on display is the holographic manuscript material. And I know you have a special interest in the manuscript material. Does it make you feel closer to the author? Do you understand him better? What's the difference between facsimile and the real thing?
Well, certainly holding and reading a manuscript just magics you off even more deeply than ink on paper, fountain pen ink on. Even though he wrote on either foolscap or exercise books, so not particularly distinguished paper, you just really feel you're hunched over his shoulder. You can see the corrections. Some of the corrections, Conan Doyle had a method of work, a style of work which did not change. First of all, he worked longhand up to his death. There was a change kind of of that flavor around 1900 small. He would send his manuscripts out to a typing service, and it was the resulting typescript that went to the publisher. But he worked longhand throughout his life. The other thing that gives you some special insight and brings you even closer to the author is as he was writing, if he thought of a change. So, for example, he would change character names, midstream. He would go back earlier in the manuscript and correct the manuscript in pen. And by and large, there are exceptions. By and large, that would describe almost all the changes he made in his manuscript. He did make a pass through his manuscripts after he finished writing them, but those corrections he invariably made in pencil. So you can see the author, you can feel, you can smell, you can taste the author bringing the story into existence and changes he's making when you have the manuscript. Now the facsimiles, I think they offer many of the same. I don't have the same emotional reaction to a facsimile as I do to the actual manuscript. But certainly in an intellectual sense, absolutely. In fact, most facsimiles are accompanied by very helpful scholarly writings about the story, about the time that Conan Doyle was writing, so whatever. And so are incredibly helpful.
Speaking of Sherlockian scholarship, before we open this up to question and answers, I want to point out that I consider Glen not just a collector, but a Sherlockian scholar of great renown. He's done the, you did an article about the pamphlet house in Edgar Smith in '91 with John Lellenberg's BSI history series.
Yes.
You did a Christmas annual, right?
Oh, yes.
That was, you did, I've seen your exhibits around, but this one, Trenches, is a part of your collection that we haven't mentioned at all.
Right.
And one of the manuscripts that you have is actually on display, I believe. The Black Peter's here.
Black Peter manuscript.
And Glen edited the BSI volume that went along with that had the facsimile in there. So I feel like I own the Black Peter, but not quite like your Black Peter. And of course, what I now consider your magnus opus, the catalog that goes with this collection. And I think Tim said that we do not have it on sale at this time like we did for the opening, but they will be here on the 20th, I believe. And this is an incredible book that I value in my collection. I believe this is Tim's copy, but it is also available online.
Yes.
But the book is so charming, and it's...
Well, you can, I believe you can order the book from Amazon.
Online.
Online.
So my question to you is now
you can shop for it.
Now that you've done this, what's next? Are we done?
Oh no, we're not done. I have two projects which are one is quite far along, one is barely along. With producing this catalog and the pandemic had been delayed. That's my excuse. I'm sticking to it. But one of them is actually, as part of the exhibit, there is a holograph speech that Conan Doyle gave in 1896 to the Authors Club in London. The title of the speech is "The Craft of Writing," or the craft of. No, but he refers to it. He refers to it in his autobiography as the work of storytelling, and it's a a wonderful speech, which he shared with his fellow authors. Where he talks about the difficulties of getting published, and what constitutes what makes a story worth embodying as a book, and it's very self-effacing and very illuminating. For example, early on in the speech, he says, "I would like to say that I went into the field of letters by a cheering ambition, but I fear it's more correct to say I was driven in by a howling creditor." And a little later on in the speech, about roughly mid-speech, he says, "I have been much upbraided for," he says, the chairman has asked me to talk about this little group of tales, Sherlock Holmes, which I have written. And I have been much upbraided for putting that fellow to death, but I maintain it wasn't murder, but homicide and self-defense, for if I hadn't killed him, he would have killed me. So there...
So are you going to do a book about...
Oh, I'm sorry. So I'm going to put... I got distracted by my own story. So I am going to produce a facsimile of that speech and a goodly number of... the associated essays with it, because it was a very, very interesting. It's a very interesting time in Conan Doyle's life. By any measure, he had, quote, made it. He hadn't quite internalized it yet by 1896. You see in his writings, he was not secure of his talent. He was not secure of his financial position, which, with the benefit of looking back 100 years hence, he was set for life. But he hadn't quite come to terms with that. Very, very. So stay tuned.
We look forward to that.
And then the other is I have a number of Conan Doyle's notebooks. Most notable is, like many Victorians, Edwardians, he kept multiple notebooks, and there was a set of 4 of them that he kept while he was living in Norwood, and they're very cleverly referred to as the Norwood notebooks. One of these notebooks, on the back side of the pages, which I hadn't looked at in great detail until I started pulling together the exhibition, is in fact clearly a version of the play that he wrote, Sherlock Holmes. See, the William Gillette, what's now properly known as the William Gillette play. And there's a play on the back of this notebook, in hand, holograph. And the scene structure is the same. Call it 2/3 of the characters are the same character names, but it's not the same play that we know of as the Gillette play. So I'm going to produce a facsimile of that.
Wow, we've got quite a few things in the works here. That's great. Look forward to it. All right, I'm going to open it up for questions. We have about 5 minutes if people would like to ask questions. Alyssa?
Pirated copies. Now that Holmes' work is copyright free, can there be a pirated copy?
No, as I understand the law, no.
Yes.
I have 2 questions, but they're related. Number one, your collection from all the years, like a black hole, nothing ever goes out. Once you've collected, it's yours.
No.
And the second part of the question is, your little bookshelf, is that still on your little bookshelf?
Actually, not only is that little bookshelf not on the those books are, but that whole bookcase is no longer with us. I have gotten rid of any number of books, and I've also deaccessioned several sections which just didn't continue. So, for example, Juvenilia. And I had a fair amount of that material, and it just wasn't. I didn't find it captivating. It's not not a reflection on that. There plenty of people love Juvenilia, period, let alone Sherlock Holmes Juvenilia. So all of that went. I have a couple of things which people might consider Juvenilia. Well, for example, Hugh Lofting, the guy who wrote about Dr. Dolittle, Talk to the Animals. He has a character, Gub Gub, the icebox detective. Well, I still have that. I still have that particular book. So that you might argue I didn't.
John, do you have a question?
And then the lady over there.
Okay.
All right, Glenn. I was fascinated by that alternative of the Sherlock Holmes play. I know that the late Necu Tekken was going to transcribe it. Do you know, was he able to finish that?
Oh yeah, he absolutely did.
Okay.
This is a great example of the generosity of collectors I've known. There's no longer with us, recently passed away, Necu Tekken, and the number of very scholarly, tremendous, in England they're called Homesians, not Sherlockians, tremendously knowledgeable, generous Homesian. I couldn't even tell you how many books, chapbooks, essays he's written or edited about Sherlock. And we actually struck up a little bit more than a casual, as fellow travelers, in a casual friendship. 10 years ago, Kath. He had an aged great aunt, I think, who lived in the San Francisco area, and he had come to the States to settle the estate when she passed away. And he was a house guest. And again, we spent many evenings sipping whiskey and actually mostly talking about the Civil War. He's quite a Civil War scholar. Sorry, the War of Northern Aggression, as the Brits call it. And but at any rate, so I had mentioned in a conversation we were talking about this is an email over email, and I was whining about this play. I had just started transcribing it, and the handwriting was not great, and it was a little slow. And he said, "Send it to me. Why don't you send it to me?" And I said, "Okay." So I made a scan of it and I sent it to Nick. And a week or two later, in my email, he had transcribed the whole play.
There's a question over here.
Yeah. I venture to say that you're probably not the only collector in the room. I would expect that a good many of the people sitting here listening to you are also collectors. I know I'm one. And one of the things that's so much fun about collecting is that just that little thrill, that charge you feel when you find something that goes into the collection. So my question to you is, do you still feel it as strongly as you did when you started collecting?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Even with the lesser items. Let me actually only slightly. Do I have time for one anecdote?
Yes.
This is about Marv Epstein. I was just beginning, and I had found in a bookstore a softbound, looks like a softbound book, but it was called a pocket magazine. And this was a dime novel, but it was upscale. They had real stories in it. It wasn't one of those penny awfuls or that sort of thing. And it had a Sherlock Holmes pastiche in it. And this was a very sophisticated piece for me at that point. And I mentioned it to Marv, and he said, "I've been looking for that book for years." And I said, "Well, why don't we trade?" And he traded me a very nice Starrett book, and I think it was
Unique Hamlet.
No, it wasn't the unique Hamlet. Although I did get my first unique Hamlet from Marv when he sold his collection. But anyway, we made a trade, and even with the benefit and wisdom of 40 plus years of collecting, it was absolutely a great trade. Dollars and cents, it made sense. What I got certainly fit my collection. What I gave Marv, what I traded to Marv. Anyway, 2 or 3 weeks later, a package shows up at my house, and there's a book in it. A note from Marv says, "I don't feel right about that collection. You should have this book too." And then 4 or 5 or 6 months later, another box shows up. He says, "I still don't feel right about it." And I promise you, it was perfect from the start.
Wow, that's pretty good. Tim, do you want to say something?
I just want to say thank you for a delightful conversation to both Dick and Glen. Also to my dean. It's unusual to have a dean of libraries who's willing to go around the room and take questions. So thank you, Lisa, for pitching in that way. Join me again in thanking these two very special people. And now I invite all of you very special people. There are refreshments out in the atrium. Please also take the opportunity, if you haven't already, to spend some time with 221 objects. Not only in this gallery on this floor, but also one floor down in the Wall and Center, you'll find the second portion of the exhibit. So again, thank you for coming this evening on a night that scared many, but we're glad you're here, and enjoy the rest of your time.